Dr. Scardina, thank you so much for joining us. Our topic here on Health Connection, autism, something that has enormous impact on families. Let's get some definitions out of the way. What is Autism Spectrum Disorder, which we now call it ASD? Give us a definition on that.
It's a pattern of deviation or delay in the development of social, communication, and cognitive skills that arises in the first few years of life. It's often associated with intellectual disability, but it's not, it doesn't have the pattern of global delay that kids with intellectual disability have.
When you say global delay, what do you mean by
that? Broad, thorough delay. It's peculiar delay. It's unique and specific delays in particular aspects of development.
So, in other ways, in some ways, the child can be normal, and then in some ways, not normal.
That's
abnormal.
it. Whereas a child with intellectual disability or mental retardation, as the old term was, is more generally and broadly delayed.
So, what are some characteristics? Autism spectrum disorder. What are we looking for?
There's two main deficit areas. One is in social communication, which is about language development, but also about the nonverbal communication patterns and social interest. The other area is in the presence of restricted or repetitive behaviors and interests. And examples of that would be kids who have odd or repetitive movement patterns.
Unusual, rocking back and forth.
Rocking, head shaking.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Or have unusual interest patterns, odd interests that other kids would not find interesting, that they seem to be preoccupied with. Spinning the wheels on a toy car, but not really playing with the car, for example.
Okay.
Or sensory difficulties that they can have, such as an unusual sensitivity to sounds or smells or touch sensations that they just can't bear or seem to crave.
Fixations on things?
Fixations on things, or just intolerance of certain, say, textures of foods or textures of clothing against their skin.
Okay. There are also some signs or symptoms to look for in the areas of social, emotional, communication skills. You just touched on this. What are the most common signs that a parent might notice first?
Most of the kids come in because parents are concerned about delays in language development. But with a kid with an autism spectrum, it's going to be language development, but it's also the nonverbal communication. Does the child make eye contact? Does the child show a social smile when parent smiles at an age when kids should be doing that? Is the child interested in people at all? So those deficits would stand out to a parent. As well, the child may show an intolerance of change, say of routine, an intolerance of certain kinds of sensations, or just a lack of interest in things. Those are the kinds of things that parents notice first, usually.
At what age should a child be returning a smile, for example?
Within the first 6 months or so, for sure.
Okay. Some children with ASD are above average intellectually. Some have severe deficits, severely disabled. Why is there such a wide range in the impact of this disease?
This really gets to the point that these are brain development disorders, and there's a lot of influences to how the different regions of the brain develop, environmental, genetic, and others. And they're discrete development of intelligence, of social and communication patterns, of interest patterns. So these are all different brain functions that have to do with different brain regions and different brain connecting circuits. And so if the child, for example, an example that kind of makes the analogy, a child with dyslexia, which is pretty severe reading and writing difficulties, might be a genius in math or in artistic skills, right? Okay, so different brain regions developing differently. The same can be true for intelligence versus the peculiar deficits in autism. Those are discrete brain functions that have different brain regions involved.
It seems like anecdotally that ASD, autism, is more common. It seems like more children developing autism. Is that the case, or other factors at work here? Or why does it seem that we see this disease more than we used to?
The consensus among the experts who really studied this question a lot is that it is not that the frequency or numbers of kids is actually increasing. It's that the definitions have gotten clearer and more specific and better. It's that awareness by parents, by healthcare professionals, by educators has improved so much the result being that we are better at, as the public health scientists say, we're better at case finding. It's better identification and younger identification. For example, the pediatric primary care specialists are much more aware of and expert about looking for this and screening kids for this now. And so we diagnose more of them and at younger ages. But the evidence doesn't seem to be that there's more kids actually having it now than before.
So it's fair to say it's always been around, but we're better at seeing it.
Exactly that.
Okay. The Centers for Disease Control, CDC in Atlanta, reports that ASD is 5 times more common in boys than it is in girls. Why are boys more prone to this disease?
That is true about all developmental disorders, that boys get it more than girls do. Boys are just more prone to these things. And there's just really speculation about this, that some of the chromosome and hormonal differences about boys versus girls that make them boys versus girls may carry more vulnerability, or conversely, that the girls are protected in some fashion from some of the genetic factors maybe, or developmental factors that could produce autism in a vulnerable child, that the girls are better protected. It also may be that boys being boys, even autistic boys, may have more behavior problems than girls do, and therefore get brought to professional attention sooner, and therefore are found sooner by healthcare professionals.
Okay. Are there other risk factors or causes besides gender that we just talked about for being born with or developing autism spectrum disorder?
The inherited risk factors seem to be the key ones. Autism spectrum disorder very much runs in families. There's a lot of gene abnormalities that are being identified in the population of autism spectrum kids. All of them seem to have relatively small risk attached to them, so there's not one gene or a couple of genes that do this. There are some chromosome or genetic conditions that have been known for a long time that carry risk for autism spectrum, and those would include things like Fragile X syndrome or tuberous sclerosis. But there's no single genetic cause beyond those that's really been well defined. In general, the genes that regulate nerve cells, how they grow, how they connect to each other, and how they migrate in the developing brain, those are the genes that seem to have the biggest risk attached to them for kids with autism spectrum. Further than that, toxic exposure, prenatally especially, as with certain medications and substances of abuse to which the baby's exposed before birth, seem to have some risk of provoking autism. And then certain infections like rubella or CMV.
What is CMV?
Cytomegalovirus. It's a respiratory virus.
Okay.
Those seem to carry some extra risk of provoking autism in the prenatal or postnatal period. Having an older father carries some risk. That's a recent finding that still remains to be explained. Men who father children at an older age seem to have more frequent autistic offspring. But with all that, and even with the best screening tests we have right now for genetic risk, the great majority of kids with autism are going to be labeled as cause unknown. The science just is not that advanced yet.
On the subject of causes, a lot of public controversy erupted several years ago with respect to vaccines causing autism in young children. Is there any science behind this? What is the truth?
It has really been studied and restudied at this point. And while there still may be some public controversy about it, and understandably so for a parent of an autistic child who wonders why, there's no scientific controversy anymore. There is not scientific evidence at this point that a child who has received vaccinations has higher risk of being autistic than a child who was never vaccinated.
What about the situation where parents have a baby and the baby appears perfectly normal, and then out of the blue, apparently things just go wrong?
A devastating experience for parents. That's been researched a good deal. The experts in brain development and autism have a pretty firm hypothesis that that probably reflects that the what's called brain pruning or nerve cell pruning goes awry. That the genes that control which circuits are going to stay active in the brain and which ones are going to shut down, which is an ongoing process as the child develops in all of us. Okay? That somehow the switching goes off in a wrong direction, and circuits that should be maintained as active that have to do with complex brain functioning instead get shut down. And so the child seems to lose ground sometimes in language development or social interest.
So, how is ASD diagnosed and how is it treated?
The diagnosis is what in medicine is termed clinical. And what that means is there's no single foolproof, sure shot diagnostic test.
We're not going to do a blood test.
We're not going to do a blood test. We'll do some tests to rule out other health conditions to assess for something else that's going on that might be contributory to it, but we're not going to likely diagnose it with a blood test, not at this point in the scientific development. So the diagnosis is a judgment that is made by ideally a very experienced healthcare professional or a team of professionals who are looking at a variety of information sources about the child to establish first, do the features fit with the autism spectrum definitions and does the course of development fit, but also are there other explanations in this child's health history or development or in their presentation that would point to other causes or contributory factors or co-occurring conditions. So it's a winnowing out the important information from the unimportant and discerning, do we have a good case for the autism spectrum as the best explanation for the child's difficulty? Should we be considering other things as well? And that diagnostic process, again, has a lot of information sources that need to be brought into it.
We say spectrum, that implies it's a continuum. It goes from very, very, very mild to very severe.
Yes.
So on the mild end of the scale, we're really being somewhat subjective, yes?
It is a harder diagnosis process, yes, for the kids who have milder conditions, and there's going to be more disagreement among professionals. But that's really where the multidisciplinary team approach is best, where a pediatrician or primary care provider is weighing in as far as physical exam, medical history, perhaps some lab studies, hearing and vision screening, where a speech and language pathologist has looked at the child and assessed speech and communication patterns, where an occupational therapist or a physical therapist have looked at the child as far as motor development and skill development, sensory processing, a psychologist, developmental pediatrician or psychiatrist experienced in developmental disorders has assessed the child and looked at this from a diagnostic standpoint. School professionals can weigh in on this, and there are specially trained behavior specialists who work a lot with autism spectrum kids who can help with the assessment too. Getting a team of people together like this and integrating all their information is what leads to the most accurate, most reliable diagnoses.
I understand it's becoming clear that timing's the key in treating autism spectrum disorder. The sooner we get to a child, sooner he or she is diagnosed and treatment has begun, the better. So what have we learned about treating this disease earlier?
The question you asked really has the answer in it. It is the earlier the treatment begins, the better the outcome for the child. There's pretty clear evidence about that. And with the assessment methods we have now, a good thorough assessment, such as we have available in East Texas through the public mental health centers like Andrews Center, through the East Texas Autism Network, through the schools. If we do it the right way, the kids can be diagnosed fairly reliably as young as 2. And getting those kids their services early on, their speech therapy, their special education services, occupational therapy, intensive behavior therapies, getting those services early on can change the outcome for the better if it's done, if we just apply what we know.
A report was recently released and published in the journal Science that outlined some really startling news. People with ASD have a lifespan 18 years on average shorter than the general population. Is ASD the cause, or are there other factors that are at work in earlier than average death rates? And how can we change these statistics?
Probably both. It can be part of the cause, but also there's other health factors. Remember that the autism spectrum disorder is kind of a product, probably in many cases, of of genetic or environmental factors, and sometimes those manifest as other kinds of health problems too. Epilepsy, for example, is very common in this population. So there's more health risks attached to being autistic because you've got other things perhaps in your health history that are going along with the autism. Second, okay, if I have a hard time noticing even some things about my body because my sensory mechanisms don't work as well, okay, I'm not going to necessarily know when something is wrong or how to interpret that. And if I have trouble with communication, with language or with social communication, I may not be able to express it very well to my healthcare provider. So people with autism oftentimes have a hard time identifying and communicating what's wrong. And of course, in healthcare, we rely on people telling us stuff
Right.
in order to help them, to understand what's going on and to help them. Third is that by virtue of having an autism spectrum disorder, an individual naturally has trouble dealing with complex systems that may require communication with lots of people. And so navigating healthcare systems, even for high-functioning, high-intellect autism spectrum individuals, may be a real daunting task, and they may not be able to access healthcare very well. And then finally, the high-functioning autism spectrum individuals in particular have relatively high rates of suicide. People with high-functioning autism have higher rates of depression, anxiety conditions, and can feel quite isolated. So bringing down that statistic of early death, bringing that more toward normal means keeping these individuals integrated into support systems lifelong, their families, their healthcare system, their community, and making sure they're not isolated, that there is somebody there running interference for them.
Okay, and that transitions nicely into our next question. You mentioned support. What can parents, teachers, and friends do to help support children and adults with ASD, and how can we help?
The parents and teachers, I think, have the most impact lifelong for the way these kids' lives turn out and how they function in adulthood. Parents have to learn about ASD. They have to kind of become experts about this because they are going to be in the driver's seat about advocating for their kids and really insisting that the kids have access to all the services they need, from special ed services to speech therapy. It may include battling with insurance companies to get services approved. It may include running down details that are getting in the way of the child having what they need at school. So parents have to become advocates, and they also, in their day-to-day living with the child, they have to find the balance. They have to walk the line between expectations that are too high and overwhelming versus expectations that are too low and don't challenge the child enough. It's quite a task for parents to manage that, but certainly I get to see some who are heroically successful at this, and their kids are far the better for it. The teachers and the schools who are committed to working with these kids can make a tremendous difference because they're in a position of benefiting the kids in terms of developing social skills, developing encouragement about what they can accomplish, teaching them actual skills, not just in classroom learning, but in how to manage the world.
Can ASD be cured?
No. No cures, and there's not going to be cures until the science goes a whole lot further than this.
So what does the future hold for this disease?
There's going to be steady progress in the science of this. The Human Genome Project and the advances that are coming in terms of being able to pick out specific genes and test them for their presence or the aberrations in the genes that are present in autism is going to shed a whole lot of light on this, and the continuing advances of technology as far as being able to analyze large amounts of data in the population will help with this a lot. The great challenge, though, in the near term, I would say the next decade and beyond, is going to be really to properly identify still the kids who have autism spectrum disorder, provide them with the school and the health services that we know are going to help them, that are proven to help, to get the services to those kids continuously over years, because it's going to take years, and then to really try to integrate these children and adults with autism spectrum disorder into the community so that our world is also their world.
Makes sense.
Because they have, so many of them have so much to offer.
Very well. Doctor, very informative. We thank you for your time.
Thank you.